Polaris with Seok Jae-ah, Choi Soo-jin, Lee Yoon-hee, and on the opposition we have A to Z with Park Hyung-jun, Cho Young-gi, and Park So-yeon. And this is the EFL finals of the second YTN Huff's Junior English Debating Championship. On our panel today, we have Dean Dawson from Hanyang University, or Hankuk University of Foreign Languages. We have Minji Kim from Ewha University. We have Shin Gon-sub from Hanyang. We have Kong Seok-jun from Korea University. And I'm Christy Bradley from Emory University, and will act as the chair. May I ask who's the timekeeper for this round? Will one of the chairs? All right, wonderful. To begin this debate, I would like to call Prime Minister Seok Jae-ah to the podium.
Ladies and gentlemen, the recent society is overflowing with violent lyrics, but there is no solid restriction on them. Now, it is the time that the government has to take action. This is the motion of today's debate, which is government should censor music with violent lyrics. Before we settle down to a deeper discussion of today's debate, I am very glad to be with the honorable adjudicators and fellow debaters on the opposition side, and will clarify two main terms in this debate. Firstly, censorship. Censorship is the censoring of violent lyrics that is considered to be harmful to society. The government censors music lyrics by urging musicians to purify them before the songs are open to the public. And secondly, violent lyrics. Ladies and gentlemen, we define violent lyrics as swear words, curses, sexual harassment, inflammatory languages, etc. Any words that exceed the limits are regarded as violent lyrics, and the limitation is set by the Committee of Broadcasting and the court. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we on the affirmative side will suffer three main ideas. Firstly, the moralizing effect upon society. Secondly, the way of making a filthy profit. And lastly, the art in the sense of true, in the true sense of the word. Let us start. I'll talk about the first and second argument, and our wonderful second speaker will talk about the last argument. Let us evolve our arguments from the first point, the moralizing effect upon society. Ladies and gentlemen, if you take a look around, you will find yourself surrounded by a great deal of violent songs with violent lyrics. At present, numerous songs possess foul languages that should not be spoken. These words float in our brains and make us insensitive to brutality and cruelty. The increase of cold-blooded criminals is not unrelated to the rise of gangsters, which contain numerous abusive inserts. They incite criminality by encouraging weapon use, spousal abuse, and so on. They send out a subconscious but consistent message affirming criminality, ladies and gentlemen. The songs also have a demoralizing influence upon the minds of youth. Born from Tamil hidden bosom, several studies have been conducted on the effects of songs with violent lyrics on behavior and whether or not it increases violent tendencies, and the answer seems to always be yes, it does. Researchers have exposed their study subjects to both the violent and non-violent lyrics of different bands and found individual personality differences in the people in the study. The study subjects were asked to classify words that can be given both aggressive and non-aggressive meanings, and the students who had listened to the violent lyrics were found to be more likely to associate aggressive meanings to those subjects. Also, subjects who were exposed to violent lyrics scored higher on aggression in several psychological tests. Ladies and gentlemen, as you can see in these cases, violent lyrics have tainted not only our ears, but also our minds and thoughts. They are disarming us against the cruelty, and they are already rampant in our society. It's unrighteous, ladies and gentlemen. We shouldn't overlook the bad influence of violent lyrics on society. In Canada, when singer Jordan Knight, formerly of the popular New Kids on the Block group, released a solo album in 1999, Canadian activists called for a boycott of the album because it included a song advocating date rape. The government should support this movement by censoring music with violent lyrics. From now on, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to talk about the songs with violent lyrics as a way of making a filthy profit, which is our second argument. The music industry exploits gangster raps, which are aimed at violence, hatred, women, gays, and lesbians. These provocative songs stimulate the ears of people, especially youngsters, and put them up to keep buying, listening, and to the albums. In the last decade, social analysts have also noted a steady increase in violent and anti-social music lyrics and images. Once relegated to the fringes, rich music full of profanity and hate has become a cash cow for the mainstream music industry. This kind of movement reached mainstream status in 2001 when the US Grammy Awards nominated Eminem for Award He Won 3, and his 2000 CD, The Eminem Show, made $3.63 million in its first month of sales. Ladies and gentlemen, the music industry engaged both our eyes and minds. How? It broadcast these songs with violent lyrics without appropriate censorship, and as a result, made a tendency to vulgar prevails throughout our society. Why? Why has the music industry ignored gangster raps with violent lyrics, ladies and gentlemen? It's because there's money in releasing songs with violent lyrics. The music industry didn't pay attention to the expected research of these kind of songs in our society. They just sought immediate gains, not considering what impacts they could have upon our society, ladies and gentlemen. They keep making the same old excuses that people want these kind of songs, and so they supply the demand for people. But ladies and gentlemen, you have to remember that it was the music industry which first introduced and boosted songs with violent lyrics in our society. And now, no matter what influence the songs have on our society, the music industry is still overlooking with violent lyrics in the hope of making much more money. Thus, ladies and gentlemen, the government should censor music with violent lyrics instead of the music industry, which is tainted with materialism. So the motion stands. Thank you.
Speakers spoke for 5 minutes and 32 seconds. I would like to thank the Prime Minister for opening this debate, and to continue this debate, I call the Leader of Opposition, Park Hyung-jun, to the podium.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, fellow debaters and honorable adjudicators. I am the leader of opposition of this debate, and our House strongly believes that government should not censor violent lyrics on songs. Our argument mainly consists of two main arguments. The first one, which is about the freedom of speech, would be provided by me, the leader of opposition, and the second argument, which is about the personal preferences and its side effects, the censorship side effects, would be provided by our Deputy Leader of Opposition. So before I introduce my first argument, let me provide some rebuttals about the government's previous points. First of all, the Prime Minister has stated that the students' minds would get bad influences when they hear violent lyrics. Of course, students might get bad influences if they hear violent lyrics. However, ladies and gentlemen, consider the statistics. A statistic from Jungang Daily in 2010 had reported that teenagers only understand and listen 30% of the lyrics on their songs. So, considering the statistics,
Why?
Rejected, ma'am. So, considering the statistic, it is obvious that it wouldn't give a big negative influence in the teenagers or the children's. Furthermore, our House strongly believes that this problem should not be solved by the government censorship. Our House strongly believes and insists that it should be solved by alternative solutions, such as preventing songs from public places like streets or parks and etc. So let me begin my first argument. My first argument, like I said, ladies and gentlemen, is about the freedom of speech. In fact, this freedom of speech had been guaranteed by the Constitution of the Republic of Korea and also the First Amendment of the America. Freedom of speech has been guaranteed by every constitution and the law in the international community. So it is obvious that government cannot take away from the message that the song gives from that person, from an individual. However, ladies and gentlemen, by censoring these violent lyrics, it might take away, it has in fact a very high possibility of taking away the message from that person, from the musicians and from the producers. We would rather suggest putting a warning on these CDs that shows that this file of music contains violent lyrics and it might be inappropriate to children or teenagers. I think these alternative solutions are much more appropriate in solving this problem. Furthermore, ladies and gentlemen, this censorship, the government's new decision to censor violent lyrics, might also control the thoughts of the musicians and producers, the individuals. To further explain, singers, composers is writing their song and they are singing their song from their minds and feelings. So obviously, if we censor the lyrics of their songs, it is obviously no different and in fact very equal from controlling or restricting their own thoughts. They cannot, I repeat, they cannot tell the consumers who buy these music CDs.
Why?
Yes, ma'am.
But the artists have no right to force their ideas by sending the songs
Clarify,
to the public.
please. Clarify. Please.
Artists have no rights to give the songs to the public so that they force their ideas to the public.
Yes, I'm not talking about artists or composers forcing their feelings or their thoughts to the consumers. I'm trying to say that governments might restrict the thoughts of the artists, which cannot be harassed or violated. And these, I'm not saying that they're forcing, but they cannot receive the thoughts of the composers or the singers. That's what I'm trying to say. So continuing with my argument. Like I mentioned before, ladies and gentlemen, singer and composers is writing from their minds and their feelings. So obviously, restricting or limiting the part of their song, in fact, a very significant part of their song, the lyrics. If the government starts to restrict or limit the significant part of these songs, the lyrics, it is eventually no different from restricting or limiting their own thoughts. Yes, to sum up, in conclusion, our house strongly believes that government should not restrict violent lyrics due to the prevention in the violation of freedom of speech of individuals. Thank you for listening. Mr. Speaker, I yield my time.
I would like to thank the Leader of Opposition for his speech, and to continue the debate, I offer the podium to Deputy Prime Minister Choi Soo-jin.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, before we talk about our last bill, I want to rebut their idea first. The opposition side of Prime Minister said that about the freedom of speech. Let me tell you about this. They said that the freedom of speech, and do you think that it is also right to use bad words to express their emotions? Well, do they have to do that? No, ladies and gentlemen, they can express their emotions using good words. Not swears, ladies and gentlemen. Also, do you think that people who listen to music will feel great? Well, I will not, because I don't like to listen swears. Also, they said that specific research and using the 30%. Anyway, however, ladies and gentlemen, have you think about the repeating? Well, and if they listen to music over and over again, then they can listen to the lyrics whole. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to present to you our third and last point, which is about the art in the true sense of the word. First of all, I have something to say to you people who think the songs with violent lyrics, such as gangster raps, or rifle kinds of art. In fact, ladies and gentlemen, they are not. What we want to say to you, ladies and gentlemen, is that the lyrics of them cannot be arts. Art is the creation of aesthetic words. ladies and gentlemen, art is a way of having knowledge and developing one's characters. Do viral lyrics can develop developing one's characters? Well, they don't. That's why we confidently tell you that viral lyrics cannot be arts. Some may say that in art, freedom and frankness are needed, as the opposition side said. However, ladies and gentlemen, we agree. However, in art, moderation and understatement are also needed. These conditions should be balanced, not inclined towards one side. Viral lyrics fail to strike balance between the freedom and the moderation. That is to say, ladies and gentlemen, the government should take measures on viral lyrics to balance them, ladies and gentlemen. I think we have to consider the people's emotion and also the definition of the word that...
Oh, ma'am.
Yes,
But
ma'am.
nobody is forcing the people to use those violence music. It's their choice.
Yes, we have to respect their choice, ladies and gentlemen. However, as I mentioned before, please think about the people who listen to music. They will not feel good. Do you like to hear bad words when you hear something? Well, I don't like, ladies and gentlemen. Now, ladies and gentlemen, go back to our discussion. That is to say, ladies and gentlemen, the government should take measures on viral lyrics to balance them. That's what the government has to do as the guard of our society. Thank you very much.
I would like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister for her speech, and I now open the podium to the Deputy Leader of Opposition, Cho Yoon-gui.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and honorable adjudicators and fellow debaters. I'm standing here to strongly say the government should not censor music with violent lyrics. And before I go on to my argument, two arguments about personal preference and side effects, I want to go to the rebuttals for the government team. Okay, first, I want to ask you and throw you one question. Why would you blame only songs for teenagers using bad words or bad effects? I think the internet or other sources are the main factors for teenagers to use or get affected by those things, not the songs, not only the songs. And as our leader of the opposition mentioned, only 30% of lyrics are understood by the teens, which means that they don't really get a lot of effect by that. So I think their first argument doesn't really stand. And going on to other rebuttals, the freedom of speech. And they have asked us a question that, do you think it's right to use bad words in the songs, even though we know how people would feel? But we couldn't really get this argument because as I was POing, nobody forces you to listen those violent music. And plus, and there's some manias who like those songs too. And some musicians want to express their feelings by bad words. And no, thank you, ma'am. And as our leader of the opposition has mentioned that those musics were not really played in public places like streets or parks, which means that they don't really have a chance to listen to their music except for their choice, except for the case they choose to listen to the music. And going on to my argument, the first one is about the personal preference. The people has a right to choose whether they want to or not want to listen to those musics. Lyrics, those bad words, are just way of expressing, so we should respect that. So even though it's a different concept, I want to give you an example. In the master pictures, there are some pictures, or there is a woman or man without clothes. So do you think it should be banned too, just because it can give a bad effect to teens? Because it's actually not really effective for them? I don't think so. They respect it, and we respect those masterpieces and those pictures because it's a form of art. It's not a thing we should censor. We should not censor the emotions or the expressions of the producer, and the musicians are one of the producers too. Musicians, they produce their feelings, and we have a right to listen, and they have a right to express. And also, music they want to listen, so censoring, and that's the reason why we think that censoring is too unfair for many musicians who want to express their feelings, and also for the manias who want to listen their thinkings, their expressions, and their music in those kind of ways. And then going on to my second argument about the side effects, the bad purpose or the bad use of government. They define those bad lyrics or the lyrics that should be censored as the bad words or the sexual harassment words or those kind of things. However, we don't think that standard is really clear. We think that it could be varied from the personal perspective, which means the government can use for themselves too. Maybe you think it could be kind of old-fashioned, but it's not. It's happening in Korea in status quo now this year too. According to Hangyeole, which is a progressive newspaper in Korea, they have said that 14 songs that are censored by Korean government annually are censored without clear reasons, which means that it is the censorship of the government just for the violent lyrics is used in a bad way, in an appropriate way, which they shouldn't. So to solve this problem, we really need a clear standard, even though we can have judge without the personal perspectives too. And going on, we have two solutions for this. First, it was kind of mentioned by our leader of the opposition. He has mentioned that musics are not played in the public places. And we think this could be a really great alternative, as people who choose to listen to music can, and people who don't really want to would not be able to listen, or would not be forced to listen to those musics. And our second solution is that put a warning under those things, CDs, and let parents or people know that there's explicit content on CDs in online music too. If you have a label, or if they put something like that, people can know, and there's no accidental listening of music, of those kind of music which have violent lyrics. And those were my two arguments. So what did I do during this debate? I rebutted the first and second argument of the government team, and I had two arguments about the personal preference and side effects, and how government could use this motion or this method, censoring violent lyrics in bad ways. And also, we provided two solutions and how we can prevent the problem for the teenagers and for the people who don't want to listen to those musics. And that's the reason why we are so proud to oppose this motion. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
I would like to thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for her speech, and I now open the podium to the Government Whip Speaker, Lee Yoon-hee.
Ladies and gentlemen, they keep urging that it is not necessary to censor the viral lyrics by government because it is infringing the right of singers and artists to impress their feelings and minds, ladies and gentlemen. But we want to argue, consider about the consequences of not censoring the viral lyrics by government, ladies and gentlemen. Before talking about our three main clashes, I'd like to rebut to two main ideas of their opinion. First, they said that it is okay not to censor viral lyrics because they said that viral lyrics don't have huge influence on teenagers because teenagers are only able to understand 30% of lyrics. Then I want to ask you a question. Does it really mean that we doesn't have to censor viral lyrics because they only understand 30% of the lyrics? It doesn't necessarily mean that it is not necessary, ladies and gentlemen. We have to censor viral lyrics, ladies and gentlemen, because, as I said before, it is subconscious and constant message, ladies and gentlemen. It can still gives bad influence to your children, ladies and gentlemen.
Why, ma'am?
No, ma'am, sir. Even though they can't understand, it can have an influence to the people. So we say that we have to censor. No, ma'am. Then I want to rebut. They said that it is the form of art and form of expression, so the government has no right to infringe that, ladies and gentlemen. But I want to say that we doesn't regard the viral lyrics as art, ladies and gentlemen. Art is a creation of aesthetic works, ladies and gentlemen. Art is the way of having knowledge and developing one's character, ladies and gentlemen. They might say that art also includes freedom and frankness, ladies and gentlemen, but we argue that also moderation and understatement is also needed to be art, ladies and gentlemen. So we strongly argue that it is not from art because the viral lyrics fail to strike the balance between the moderation and freedom, ladies and gentlemen. Then let's move on to our three main clashes. Our first clash is that is government censorship appropriate. They said that because there are alternatives, there are alternatives that are appropriate. We don't have to censor the violent lyrics, ladies and gentlemen. But we say to you that that it is not limiting the thoughts of musician and limiting the feeling of musician, ladies and gentlemen. When we suggested the government censorship, that we said. Government censorship was said because we have to protect the children, protect the teenagers, and protect all people from the influence of violent lyrics. Even though they don't willing to listen to, and it is not a choice. It is not a choice. They can listen. They can listen to the violent lyrics, and to rebut their ideas that listening to the violent lyrics is their choice. I'd like to say, with the facts that with the argument that we supposed before, we said the music industry exploits gangster raps, which are aimed at violence, hatred, women, gays, and lesbians. These provocative songs stimulate the ear of people, especially youngsters, and put them up to keep buying and listening to the album, ladies and gentlemen. So we say that people who make the ones who make the people buy the album and listen to the music is the entertainment industry, because it is stimulating the ears and minds and thoughts of listeners, ladies and gentlemen. Then let's move on to our second classes. The summon first violin lyrics. As I said before, there's no one who is trying to say that you have to listen to violin lyrics, ladies and gentlemen, but we're saying that the violin lyrics is still the violin, which is violin to you, ladies and gentlemen. As I said before, we said that it's because the violin lyrics and violin songs stimulate the ear and thoughts and minds of the people, ladies and gentlemen. We said that it should be censored. It is subconscious. It is something that is subconscious. It cannot be always the choice, ladies and gentlemen. And if it is the choice of the listener chooses to listen to that because he is addicted. He or she is addicted because it stimulates the ear and minds and thoughts, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, sir.
Not all people who listen to music are all addicted. Don't you think it's just a generalization to say that?
It might be the generalization, but it's true that the violin lyrics stimulate the ears and minds and thoughts, sir. Then let's move on to our third main clashes. Is it the choice to listen to violin lyrics? As I said before, it is the same. It is the same case. They have the choice to listen to violin lyrics. But as what I want to say to you is that because we can say that they are willing to listen to music because of their will, but we say to you that is because the violin lyrics stimulate the ears and minds and thoughts. And as I said before, at present, numerous songs possess full languages that should not be spoken. These words flood in our brains and make us sensitive to cruelty and violence, ladies and gentlemen. And increase of cold-blooded criminals is not unrelated to the rise of gangster raps, which contain numerous abusive insults. That we cannot say that we don't necessarily have to censor the violent lyric because it is the right of citizens. We have the right of we have the duty to protect the children, protect the citizens from the violent lyrics, and also from the violent lyrics, and also we have to prevent the future criminal which is infected by the violent lyrics, ladies and gentlemen. Because of these reasons, we urge you to stand by your side. Thank you.
I would like to thank the whip speaker for her speech, and I now offer the podium to the whip speaker from the opposition, Park So-hyun.
As an opposition whip, I'm standing here to prove why we should protect the freedom of choice, both listeners and the people who make the song. We, the opposition, is here to prove why the government should not censor the music with violent lyrics. Throughout this debate, I found three clashes that would wrap up this debate and that would prove that the opposition team take this debate home. The first clash is the bad influence. And second one is who has the responsibility for solving this problem. And thirdly, the feeling of people who do not want to listen and who want to listen. Then let me go on to my first clash. The first clash is the bad influence for both others and the children. The Prime Minister of the government argues about the aggression. The Prime Minister of the government argued that people who hear violent lyrics has a possibility of becoming aggressive. However, with the statistics and article from Jungang Daily, we proved. And I'd like to prove again why their arguments fail at this level, ladies and gentlemen. According to the Jungang Daily, as the Prime Minister and the Deputy Leader of the Opposition said, people who listen to violent lyrics was questioned whether they understand the songs and lyrics or not. However, only 30%, ladies and gentlemen, rejected them. People did not understand, only 30% of people just understand what is being said, and all had buried comprehension as to what the message was. And finally, if the lyrics was not included in the artist's booklet, the audience would never know what was being said according to the article, ladies and gentlemen. With these statistics, we did not find any relations between the aggression and the violent music and lyrics, ladies and gentlemen. Also, we are really curious whether these violent lyrics lead to the future crime. The government argues about the future crime, but we believe it is a logical fallacy, which is slippery slope. We are really curious why this leads to future crime, and we believe it was too extreme statements to be mentioned. Also, we'd like to talk about the others' rights and others' freedom of choice. We'd like to ask the government team whether others get bad effects from this motion or not, because the others are mature enough and they have their own standard of listening. We cannot understand their logic that they are even violating the others' freedom of choice. The second clash is who has the responsibility of solving this problem. The government strongly argues that the problem should be dealt with by the government because their motion. However, we found their arguments very problematic. First, it violates the listeners and artists' their freedom of choice, as the leader of the opposition mentioned. Because the freedom of choice is well mentioned in the amendment and the laws. No one has the right to violate what others want to hear, what others want to write, and what others want to enjoy. Which the opposition believes that the government is violating the fundamental and the primary rights that should never be violated under any circumstances. Well, there can be some people who do not want to listen to these songs. So what the opposition has done is we gave two alternatives to solve this problem, and I'd like to list this again. So we gave an alternative and we gave a solution. The first one was preventing these violent lyrics and violent songs in the public so that people who do not want to listen to these violent lyrics will not hear, and people who want to listen to these violent lyrics can enjoy their songs themselves. And secondly, we gave a second alternative, which is warning, which means we will inform people that the music includes violent lyrics or not, and we believe these alternatives are more effective than the government motion. The third clash is the feeling of people who listen to this music, even though this clash is combined with some clashes, we found their arguments really problematic and faulty. First, I'd like to divide into two terms. First, there are really people who want to listen to the violent lyrics. Because they are violating the people who wanted their lyrics, we believe their motion does not stand. And also, what they talked about is the people who do not want to listen to their violent lyrics. And we are really curious whether they heard our two alternatives or not. We gave two clear and effective alternatives, and we believe our motion, the government should not censor music with violent lyrics. Then I'd like to organize what we have done for today's debate. The purpose of this motion is to decide whether the government should censor the violent music or not. Therefore, what should we focus on is the rights of listeners, the roles of the government, and the violent lyrics. The government's burden of proof is to prove why it doesn't violate the listeners who want to listen to violent lyrics, and prove why it affects people negatively. And by giving the 30% statistics, and by telling the people who want to listen to these violent lyrics, we prove why their arguments fail at this level. However, the opposition's burden of proof is to prove the rights of listeners are being protected, we gave alternatives, and we believe we fully explained about the point. And the second burden of proof was that it doesn't affect teen negatively, and we believe we must answer this point as well. And we'd like to clarify and we'd like to emphasize that the side effects that was given by the deputy leader of the opposition was not answered by the government, which means they did not have anything to talk about it. And because of these reasons and because of this burden of proofs, we believe the opposition should take this debate home. And we, the opposition, will not let the government to get in the way of people that they want to listen to their to the songs that they want to listen, even though it contains violent lyrics. Therefore, the motion does not stand.
I would like to thank the whip speaker from the opposition for closing the constructive portion of this debate. For the first reply speech, I offer the podium to Cho Yoon-gui from the opposition.
Good evening again, ladies and gentlemen. As the opposition reply speaker, I'm standing here to prove you why the government shouldn't censor the songs with violent lyrics. Actually, I cannot really understand why the government is just blaming songs for those criminal and bad effects of teenagers. Because there are movies, internet, and there are a lot of other sources that can affect those people. Song is not only the source that people get bad effects. So just censoring songs, those violent songs, doesn't make any sense and cannot help stopping those problems. And it's really unfair to make a decision to censor violent music, giving those faults all to violent songs. And I think the important word of this debate is a choice. We are saying the choice is important because the government team has also admitted that the people has a choice. But people know that what kind of music they want to listen to. And in a circumstance that we have mentioned, that in the public places, those violent songs will not be played. The people have a choice, and people can choose if they want to listen or not, as the deputy leader of the opposition has mentioned. And I couldn't understand why their argument about why they couldn't really answer to the argument about the side effects. So from this point, I want to explain our three arguments and end up this debate. Our three arguments were freedom of speech or expression, and second was personal preference, and third was about the side effects. And I have a burden of proof in this point about the side effects. We gave two clear standards. How they didn't really give any clear standards. I have burden of proof for the government to give clear standard of the violent lyrics, because it could differ from person to person. The standard can differ from person to person. The government can use in a bad purpose, as we have mentioned, and there could be a lot of side effects, and it's happening now in Korea and it's at school too. So I'm not really sure that they have answer to this problem. And they couldn't answer to this argument. And also, we think that we shouldn't censor the form of art, as the music is form of art and musicians are one kinds of artists too. We shouldn't censor those violent lyrics for these reasons, and that is why we are so proud to oppose this motion, and the motion does not really stand. Thank you.
I would like to thank the reply speaker from the opposition for her speech. And now to close this debate, I offer the podium to the reply speaker from the government, Seok Jae.
Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, we want to clarify why we on the affirmative side support the motion. It's because support the motion that we should censor the songs, because the song is the source that's repeated most, and we are not supporting the motion to eliminate the fundamental cause. And ladies and gentlemen, throughout the debate, the opposition side allows their claim government should not censor music pretending that the opposition side protect the rights of artists. However, it is us, the affirmative side, that really balance the freedom of both artists and consumers. We supported our motion by stating our three main arguments. In our first argument, demoralizing effect upon society, we are clear that there are enormous bad influences in our society by proposing solid cases and researches. The opposition side admitted that there are bad influences, and so we clarified the opposition side couldn't argue about this argument. In our second argument, the way of making a filthy profit, we clarified that the music industry exports gangster raps, which are aimed at violence, hatred, women, gays, and lesbians, the opposition side again didn't deny that the music industry is getting filthy profits from gangster raps. The music industry opens songs with violent lyrics because it can make much money. It is a soul effect, and so the opposition side couldn't argue about this argument again. In our third and last argument, freedom of choice, we roughly claim that we have to think not only people who listen to the music, but also artists. Thanks to our true meaning of art, we cannot regard songs with violent lyrics as pieces that are okay to open to the public, even though they are art. The artists can enjoy their words for themselves, not instilling the violent lyrics. By conducting censorship, we can strike a balance between freedom of both sides. Even though we proposed a solid limitation that is decided by the court and Committee of Broadcasting, the opposition side ignored and didn't provide any better and reliable alternatives. In the case of Korea, which the opposition side provided, that's why we strongly claim that we should reinforce the limitation by censorship. And ladies and gentlemen, the bad influences that the affirmative side provided far outweigh the side effects they provided. A little side effects are always triggered when the government tries to implement a system that looks forward to long-term benefits. Thus, ladies and gentlemen, we on the affirmative side take this debate home. Thank you.
Now, I'd like to thank the reply speaker from the government for closing this debate. Congratulations to both grand finalist teams. I encourage you to cross the stage and congratulate each other.